Hello, everyone. This is Emily Brummett with the Colorado Water Congress. Thank you for joining us for today's August webinar, The Hidden Value of Landscapes, Implications of Drought Planning, with Colorado State University's Horticulture Extension Agent, Alison O'Connor. The Colorado Water Congress is proud to offer webinars and workshops as benefits to our members in Colorado's water community. You can learn more about the Colorado Water Congress and upcoming events at www.cowatercongress.org. I have just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. First off, I'd like to thank our presenters and our members. These presentations are made possible by your support. Today, our presenter is Alison O'Connor, a horticulture extension agent at CSU. Alison is the Colorado State University Extension Horticulture Agent in Larimer County. She has been with the extension for 10 years. Alison coordinates the Larimer County Master Gardener Program and assists homeowners and industry with horticulture questions. She attended Iowa State University and The Ohio State University, majoring in horticulture, and completed her PhD at Colorado State University in 2014, studying nursery tree production and landscape establishment. In her spare time, she enjoys golfing, tending to her backyard chickens, and growing giant zucchinis for competition. That's very cool. Today's webinar will last for about half an hour, between half an hour and 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions. As attendees, you are muted throughout the webinar. If you have questions or comments, please type them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar. If you have any technical questions, please email me at ebrummett, that's E-B-R-U-M-I-T, at cowatercongress.org. We're recording today's webinar, and it will be available later this afternoon on CWC's YouTube channel. Without further ado, I will pass it off to you, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Emily, and thank you to everyone who's attending. I'm here in Denver at the Colorado Water Congress headquarters, which is great, and I am excited to talk to you today about the white paper that myself and my colleagues, Zach Johnson and Tony Koski, worked on. It was really enlightening, and we found out a lot of great information, and without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. And for those of you who are wondering, my giant zucchini failed at this county fair this year. I was dethroned again by a Master Gardener volunteer, so clearly I need to improve my gardening skills.
Wait, you were dethroned as in you were previously on the throne?
Yes, I was on the throne for 3 years, and I've been dethroned the last 2.
That's really cool.
So, yeah. I will say that growing zucchini, giant zucchini, is not very water safe or sensitive.
Okay.
But that's okay. So the reason why we did this paper, we were proposed by ALCC, the Associated Landscape Contractors of Colorado, to create a document that was similar to the California White Paper. So you may have seen this. The California White Paper was developed by the University of California Extension, and essentially what they were doing is they were talking about some misguided and maybe misconcepts regarding water use in California, and they titled it the 9%. So what they discovered is through their research, 9% of water use was used for landscapes in California. And so we paired our paper off of that and called it the hidden value of landscapes. And what we did is we did similar justification for landscapes. So we all know that when times get tough, when we don't have a lot of water, if we don't have the snowpack that we usually do, water tends to be one of the first things, and especially landscapes tends to be one of the targeted areas of stopping water use or maybe pulling up landscapes and things like that. And so that's really how it started. And so it's really a pretty exhaustive literature review of the benefits of landscapes, what they can do for our communities, and also all that they give us based on that 3%. So 3% of Colorado's water, and that's water that originates in Colorado, 3% of all of that water is used for landscapes and recreational areas. So that does include home landscapes, it includes golf courses, it includes parks, and all of our other urban landscape areas, as well as natural areas and things like that if they're on irrigation. So 3% is a pretty small drop in the bucket, which is what we're trying to really show with our graphic there. It should be noted that other uses of water could be for agricultural use, for drinking water, for hydraulics, for industry, and things like that. And then, of course, a large portion of the water that originates in Colorado also leaves our state and goes to other states or goes downstream for other uses as well. But we're going to talk about that 3% and your return on investment and how beneficial it is to our communities. So in Colorado, we know that drought is inevitable. So I moved here in 2005, and that was just after one of the worst droughts that Colorado had experienced. So I wasn't here during the quote-unquote really bad drought years, but there seems to be a cycle, as you know, with drought in Colorado. We had a touch of drought back in 2012, 2013, and it is a cycle that we will see, and we'll see it again. So just like Hurricane Harvey is dropping the 800-year flood, it is inevitable that we will have drought and face water shortages again in the coming years and decades. And with that, because Colorado's population is increasing so rapidly, where by 2050 we're expected to be about double where we are now at about 9 million people, there has to be a way to accommodate for the people that are moving into the state with the water that we have. And so conserving water and making sure that we make wise choices as to how the water is used, conserved, and those kind of things is incredibly important. And this is also paired after the Colorado Water Plan that was adopted in the last year. So the demand for water will increase as our populations increase. That's what the state of California has found, kind of prompting their paper. And obviously, we have made huge strides in conserving water and making good choices and helping Coloradans become aware of conservation, but it's an ongoing battle, and it's an ongoing thing that we all have a part in conserving water. And when we take these steps, we can better face those natural disasters that occur. So I'm from Larimer County. We've had our share of fires in the last few years due to drought and things like that, and it's just a way of being able to prepare for natural disasters better. I'm currently living in Windsor, and about 10 years ago we had a tornado, and so Colorado has its share of natural disasters as well as other things, and drought would be considered one of those. And with temperature extremes, with us not necessarily getting those regular rains that perhaps we used to, all of that has a play in how water is used. So we have made huge strides to conserve, and I would say that Coloradoans, with the help of water districts and other organizations, have really made enormous impact already on conserving water. So there's some data that said we've already reduced per capita water consumption by nearly 20%. Just in the past 10 years, which is nothing short of incredible. That's a huge amount of water that has been saved. And when we had the drought back in the early 2000s, tiered water pricing, which is still in effect, new technology, so that's a great thing. Landscape use technology with sprinkler systems and heads and things like that have really made it much more easy for even homeowners on the homeowner side, which is who I primarily work with, to implement water conservation practices. Another thing I work a lot with is planting appropriate plant materials. So obviously Colorado has a lot of transplants. I am one of them. I'm from Minnesota, where we have 10,000 lakes. And it was a change, absolutely, to adjust my gardening practices and learn the plant material that does well. So the use of native plants or using drought-tolerant plants is important. And then my whole shtick with extension is, of course, to provide outreach education. So how can we help HOAs, how can we help homeowners make better choices and help them become more aware? One of the great programs that we have at CSU in Larimer County and some other Front Range counties is a program called Lawn Check, where we will go out and actually assess homeowner lawns, mostly for diagnostic issues, but more often than not it comes down to drought stress. But during those conversations, almost always, we can recommend changing your irrigation plan, maybe swapping out irrigation heads from pop-ups to spray rotors, and really helping extend conservation on the homeowner level that way. And we just need to continue with this. So the ROI, the return on investment of that 3%, this pie chart is not, it's just divided up, but there's a lot that you can get for that 3% of the total water use. And we'll just touch on a few of them, and then the paper that we wrote has a lot more information. It cites all of our sources, which is really important. And like I said, it's a literature review. So this is not original research that CSU did. but it is a literature review of what occurred and what other research is done. And there's amazing research out there if you haven't delved into it. So one of the first big things is, of course, carbon sequestration. So we all know that plants take in carbon. So that's in the form of pollutants. It's in the form of us expelling our breath. And carbon sequestration is huge. And it doesn't seem like it's a lot, but when you're in an urban area like downtown Denver, when you have a lot of cars and traffic and buildings and factories and things like that, vegetation can offset the production of fossil fuels by quite a bit. Trees are excellent sources of storing carbon, and it's been found that trees can actually store up to 5% of those human-caused carbon emissions. Lawns I think are the one that maybe get the worst rap when it comes to water shortages and drought. But lawns, especially a well-maintained lawn, and that's the important thing, a lawn that's well-fertilized, well-maintained, will actually do a better job at storing carbon than a lawn that's neglected or perhaps not fertilized as well. And they can actually store carbon for up to 30 years. So some of the older lawns may not be storing as much carbon, but with all of the new development that's occurring throughout Colorado, those new lawns are great at storing carbon. And when we lose trees, we're losing that carbon storage. So of course we have the imminent threat of emerald ash borer, which of course is still in Boulder County at this point today in time. But with that likely to get to other communities and where we're losing trees and old trees, we're going to be facing some difficult things with carbon. And it's also well known that well-placed trees around the home can reduce the need for heating and cooling. And there's a whole concept of landscape design that goes into tree placement as well. Airborne pollution is another thing. So we know that trees trap carbon. They can also trap airborne pollutants, and they act basically like pollution scrubbers. So all that green material kind of scrubs the air clean of pollutants. And the Denver Metro and their forestry department has done an incredible job of assessing the urban and public trees. And they found that in a year, the air quality benefits that the trees provide is in excess of $1.7 million. And so trees, while they appear to just be standing there, are doing a lot for the community and a lot to help improve the air quality in the state of Colorado. And of course, we know that plants create oxygen. So when you took your beginning biology class back in probably 5th grade, 6th grade, something like that, that's the first thing you learn. So when I teach Arbor Day to the 5th graders in Fort Collins, it's like, what do plants do for us? And always the first thing is, they give us oxygen. And it's true, it's the important thing, it's what we breathe in, and then they take the byproduct, which is carbon dioxide, and use it in the process of photosynthesis. But what's important is that just 55 square feet of turf is enough for oxygen for one person a day. That's not a lot of green space. It could be a couple shrubs. A tree, one mature tree can be enough oxygen for a family of 4 for a year. The same thing could be extrapolated to our field crops like corn and sugar beets and things like that. They're all giving oxygen and providing those benefits as well. They're just not landscape plants usually. And then, of course, we've had a pretty hot summer. It was hot and dry through most of July, and then we had the monsoon rains come in August, and then people got grumpy because they thought it would never stop raining. And now we're back in a hot, dry period where we haven't had rain for another few weeks, at least not up in the Fort Collins area. But vegetation can actually provide a cooling effect, and so it can reduce those hardscape surfaces. So especially in an area like downtown or in heavily areas with a lot of hardscape, buildings, pavement, sidewalks, things like that, those temperatures can actually be up to 40 degrees hotter than under the shade of a tree. So growing up in the Midwest where we had lots of humidity, I went to school in Iowa, that corn adds so much humidity to the atmosphere. I always laugh because when my dad and I moved into my dorm, when he moved me into my dorm freshman year, I remember him getting out of the car and his glasses fogged up because there was so much moisture in the air. It was hilarious, actually. But it was tough, in those dorms without air conditioning. But what you'll notice is that people are desperate for any sort of shade. So if they go to a shopping complex, they will look for even a tiny little honey locust that provides dappled shade, and they will park under it because obviously it's cooler, and not having a lot of humidity in the atmosphere is really going to help with those cooling effects, and so we feel it a lot more. And like I said, those trees can actually also help with your energy savings. With stormwater management, this is a big thing. I was in Portland for a conference this summer, and of course the Oregon area, especially on the eastern side, gets a lot of moisture, and it was one of their banner years for moisture. And they've designed these rain gardens when they have moisture. So when you have impervious surfaces like sidewalks and driveways and things like that, the water can just run off. But when you have pervious surfaces that can actually absorb stormwater, can absorb some of that, not only is it helping filter that water, it's also helping with soil erosion and doing a lot of benefits in that case, and it's keeping that water in that area. So it's not only watering the landscape, but it's also doing benefits where it's helping clean some of the sediment from those areas, and it reduces that sediment into our lakes and rivers and sewers and gutters and things like that as well. Obviously, landscapes are a great place for wildlife. So golf courses are another one, and as a golfer, I advocate for golf courses. But golf courses, HOAs, commercial properties, they have programs like the Audubon International where they can actually become certified as sanctuaries to promote plant material. There was a golf course in Florida that actually was harboring or encouraging the use of I think it was an insect that was actually thought to be extinct, and they found it on a golf course. Golf courses also and HOAs can have environmentally sensitive areas where they might have populations of birds or salamanders or snakes or anything like that, so they can provide habitat for these animals. They can provide areas for when they do migration corridors and things like that. So geese, pros and cons, take them or leave them, but they are a species of wildlife. And a lot of these areas can also provide food and shelter for these animals to reproduce. So they give these animals a green space in order to have a healthy life. For homeowners and for property managers, for those who own commercial businesses, investing in landscape has been proven to be a really good return on investment, and I always joke that it's better than redoing your kitchen, which is about an 80% return on investment. In this case, you get 135% return on investment. They've done studies with the Realtor Association where realtors will bring a potential buyer up to a home, and based on the landscape, the buyer makes a decision pretty darn quickly. Even if the inside of the house has been completely redone, if there's been neglect or the outside, has shrubs that need to be pruned or the lawn doesn't look that great, they'll make a decision very quickly whether or not it's a house they can see themselves living in. My mom currently has her house on the market in Minnesota, and she's put a lot of time in her outside gardens, and her curb appeal is great, and all of that can lead to a better selling price by up to 15%. In some areas, actually, studies have shown that it's up to 20% of your home's value can be based on outside landscapes. And it can also increase rent prices, which is super because it gives people a sense of community where they can go home, or even at work if they have a green space to go to, they can then make connections with nature. And so all of that is good. So having well-maintained property and trees and green space really can increase the property values as well. Of course, landscapes improve our lives. If we didn't have landscapes, if we didn't have open space, if we didn't have parks, for those living in the city, dog parks are a great place, a little bit of green spot within the city. It's awesome to have your dog socialize. They give kids a place to play. And with that movement that kids need to move more, we need to provide those opportunities for kids to find outdoor space in order to recreate, get their energy out, instead of having screen time and things like that. It also provides a place for people to connect and socialize, a place to communicate. And so dog parks, as the photo shows, is a great example. So I have two beagles who are not the most athletic of dogs, but they really enjoy getting to know other dogs at the dog park. And for them, it's just an atmosphere where they can sniff to their heart's delight. Like, obviously, beagles have so keen of noses and sniffing, but they get to know the dogs, and then you end up talking to people that you may not otherwise speak with in your community. And so it's a really great area to improve your lives. And worldwide, landscapes and trees also provide meeting places. So this is a photo from Kenya, where this is the town meeting or the village meeting in Kenya. And so, you know, meet me at the big oak tree, and we can talk about whatever issue is pressing. And so landscapes can also span gender, right? So I grew up, my grandpa was a master gardener in Minnesota, and so it's great that I now coordinate the Master Gardener program, but Grandpa had an affinity for roses and for growing vegetables. And so I had that connection with my grandpa, and sometimes we just were losing that connection with agriculture, and open space can provide that. And Grandpa lived on a small city lot. He dedicated a large portion of his lawn to growing vegetables, and that was my first connection. So spanning those generations and providing space for that is really important. You've probably heard about how landscapes can reduce crime, and it is true. I think there's a little bit of a misnomer out there where if you have heavy vegetation around a building, it can actually increase crime, because people might think that criminals could hide behind the shrubs or things like that. But actually the reverse is true, that actually it helps build communities. And so in inner city communities, there's been a lot of research in the Chicago area and some of the low-income neighborhoods, and what they found is that having green space or having an option to garden, as you can see here, it can mitigate irritability. So if you had a really tough day at work, instead of going home and perhaps arguing with your family, if you go home and you pull a few weeds, or you're able to connect with nature, it helps reduce those stress levels. It helps decrease impulse behavior, and those can all lead to greater violence. And residents in public housing, so this was an interesting study that they did. They had two high-rise buildings, one that did not have any vegetation around it, and one that did, just some lawns and some trees and shrubs. And what they found is that the building that had the green space had 25% less or fewer domestic crimes than the building that didn't have a landscape. And that's a huge number. So what they found is that people, they were hanging out outside, so they got to meet Mrs. Jones. And if they didn't see Mrs. Jones, they would wonder where Mrs. Jones was. Or they would get to know their neighbors and then, build these relationships, and they would form essentially families in their apartment complexes. So areas that had the highest vegetation actually had the lowest crime rate compared to those that had no vegetation, and they had a much higher crime rate. With studies with child development, this was an interesting study, children diagnosed with ADD, even if they were just exposed to a photograph of green space or just a simulation on a computer of a forest or an open space area, their symptoms tended to be reduced. They had less stress. They were able to participate more in activities and things like that. And obviously, like I said, it provides areas to play and be a kid. So when I was growing up, we were outside all summer, and then we'd come in when Mom called us for dinner. But it's a little different these days, but we still need to provide those opportunities for our kids and get them outdoors, because it also helps with their intellect and their cognitive function, and it helps them really kind of embrace some of those social areas that they may not always get. For adults and for kids, on surveys done, 66% of people, when they're stressed, if they had a bad day or a frustrating meeting or something that was causing them stress, most people tend to retreat to a natural setting. And when they did surveys of people who were experiencing stress, and so this is kind of an interesting study where they would show people photographs of stressful situations, whether it be a natural disaster or something that would really kind of make the body respond to a stressful situation. When they followed those photos with a picture of green space or flowers or trees or a golf course, their stress levels decreased, and 95, this is a huge amount, 95% of people who felt stressed felt calmer when they were able to embrace a green area. And so if you're having maybe not the best day today, maybe after this webinar you can take a quick walk and find some green space, and hopefully you'll feel a little bit better. Landscape and gardening in particular is a great way to meet the Center for Disease Control guidelines for physical activity. So they have actually officially said that gardening is a form of exercise. And if you walk and mow your lawn, if you have a big lawn that takes you an hour, you can burn almost up to 400 calories. And that's based on a person that weighs 150 pounds. So if you weigh less or more, it'd obviously be a little bit different. Another study found that people who had a community garden had lower BMI. So they had lower weight, they tended to be more healthy, they were eating the vegetables that they grew. And it was a very interesting study because there was one that actually compared twins. So they had twin brothers, one who was in the community garden, one who was not in the community garden, and then compared their health and their BMI. And the twin that was gardening in the community garden had better health at the end of it, which is really interesting. For senior adults or those who are aging, it helps with grip strength. So using tools can help with grip strength. It can help you with mobility. Gardening can also use muscles that are important, especially core muscles. So if you think about if you spend time hoeing or getting rid of weeds in your garden using the appropriate tools, you're using your upper core strength, which is important for adults as we tend to get older. It can also help with our overall health and fitness. So this is kind of a famous study. It was done back in 1983, and that's when gallbladder surgery was a 1 or 2 night stay in the hospital. Obviously, gallbladder today is an outpatient surgery, but what they found is this has been around for a really long time, and what they found is that they took patients who had their gallbladders removed, put some patients in a room where they couldn't see open space and other patients in a room where they could see open space. And the ones who were able to see green space took less pain medication. They were less grumpy with the nurses. They got discharged sooner. And so there is something where it really helps you have a better outlook and optimistic look at life. And so it can reduce medical bills, which is important, I think, for the medical community. So if you've been in new hospitals lately or any sort of medical centers, a lot of them are starting to put in healing gardens or green space for patients so that they can have that connection again with nature to reduce stress. And also for the staff, that's really important as well. Memory gardens are another big thing. And so my grandma was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she was in the nursing home for the last 8 years of her life. Her way of coping maybe with her diagnosis, which of course she probably didn't quite realize, but what she did was pace the hallways every day. Pace the hallways back and forth, and we used to laugh because Grandma would go through a pair of sneakers like an athletic endurance runner. She would go through sneakers about every 2 months, and she would actually wear holes through the soles because she would walk so much. Memory gardens are designed as a circular garden, and so the patients can't get lost. They basically follow the path around. They're enjoying the green space. There's also a lot of horticultural therapy, which goes into healing gardens and memory gardens to really help build and help those patients have a relaxing place. And so that's really important. So those are some of the benefits, but the unintended consequences, if we decide to get rid of all of our landscapes or make drastic decisions on water use, some of the unintended consequences can be pretty severe, and people may not necessarily understand how it could extrapolate into their future and their community as well. So the Cash for Grass program, so California, as you probably have heard, has gone through a very serious drought. A lot of the agriculture industry was pointed out because of the almond production and things like that, and the data came out that 1 almond takes 5 gallons of water to produce. So the Cash for Grass program was focused on businesses and homeowners. And what they found is, and this is why the Californians wrote their original white paper, the 9% of water use. And so when water becomes scarce, landscapes are an easy thing to target. But what they found in California is that the Cash for Grass, if people decided to remove their lawns, to take out their irrigation systems, they would get essentially free money. So it sounds great, right? You get money up front. You don't have to deal with the lawn and the maintenance and everything that goes into it. But what's been found now is when they started doing this, even just a couple years ago, everything else that was left in the landscape, particularly mature trees, started to suffer. So if you take out the irrigation or you just stop irrigating trees that have been irrigated their whole life or are used to getting some sort of water, if you just stop completely and then there's no natural precipitation, you're going to have consequences. And so this is an example of the cash for grass. And so again, they remove all of the turf, they remove all of the benefits that turf provides, they add some plants, they rock it in, and I think you can probably agree that this is not the most attractive landscape. So you wonder, environmentally, what is it doing? You know, aesthetically, this house, I think, has lost a lot of its appeal. But the bigger question is you have these mature trees, which we've talked about. They provide shade, they provide you energy benefits and your cooling bills and things like that. If you stop giving them irrigation, how long are they going to last? And then you lose a tree that's 30 years old. And then the question is, how long does it take to get a tree that's 30 years old back in your landscape? So rockscapes, and absolutely rock has a place in the landscape, but just rocking over a landscape is not always the best solution. So rocks can increase ambient temperature. You're never going to tell your kid, hey, you know, Junior, go play in the rocks, because that's not that great compared to, you know, have a baseball match in the backyard. It really provides a limited space for dogs to habitate, for kids to play, and you don't necessarily get rid of the landscape maintenance. So weeds will grow in rock. You will still perhaps need to use herbicides or other forms of removal, and it can provide a really disjointed look to neighborhoods. So you've probably driven down streets where there's a beautiful landscape, maybe a landscape that's completely rocked in, and it doesn't necessarily tie the neighborhood together. And the bigger thing too is that you lose those carbon storage benefits. So we talked about turf and how it can store a lot of carbon, how trees can store carbon, and if you rock something in, you're not getting those environmental benefits as well. You can also have an increase in ambient air temperature. So they've done a lot of work with infrared technology, and so anything in this that's kind of a yellowy color, it's a hotter part. So if they did an infrared of downtown Denver, obviously the buildings would be much hotter than any sort of green spaces. I mentioned earlier how shaded streets are often cooler and how vegetation plays a role in those shaded streets. So when push comes to shove, if ideas of converting to all rock or even replacing natural grass with synthetic turf, it doesn't help with these cooling effects, right? So even though we have something green, synthetic turf especially is not going to help with those benefits. The next series of photos I have were taken by my colleague, Dr. Koski, who's actually on this paper with us. And so he works a lot with golf courses, sports turf managers, and things like that. So he was at the Broncos practice facility a few years ago, and he decided to do some temperatures. So this is the air temperature at the Broncos practice facility. It was sometime, I think, in September. So just a shade over 80 degrees. And then their practice facility field is synthetic turf. So what they play on for their real games is actually natural grass, but their practice facility is synthetic turf. And you can see the turf temperature, the synthetic turf temperature, was about 50 degrees hotter at 130 degrees. So imagine if you are a football player, full pads, running drills, it's going to be really hot. I will say offhand that the CSU football stadium opened last weekend, and it is also synthetic turf, and there were temperatures reported, at least on the practice facility up in Fort Collins, of 140 degrees. So it's hot. It's really hot. And then, so the synthetic turf temperature was 130, and then just outside of the Broncos practice facility is some natural grass, and that turf temperature was just about 90 degrees. So just about 8 degrees warmer than your air temperature. But remember, again, turf is cooling itself. You get some cooling benefits from that. So I would say that in that case, most players would probably prefer a natural turf surface. Some other headlines with synthetic turf and why it may not be the best solution, not only for practice and playing fields, but also for homeowners to replace their natural grass. This is a headline out of Los Angeles where the turf actually melted. There was another story earlier this year where a university in Utah, and you wouldn't think that Utah would get so hot, but it was May, graduation was occurring, and they actually had to move the graduation ceremony inside because they were planning to have it on their synthetic turf stadium, and it was too hot. And you know, people in those black robes and hats, they would have melted like this turf. This is a photograph of an aerial view, and again, an infrared picture. And this is in Pennsylvania, and so you can see the two blue circles. So the big circle in the middle is the Central Tech football field, which is a natural grass facility, so you can see how it's green, compared to the varsity field for one of the local high schools, and how you can see how it's a much more shaded red. So you can again see just the temperature differences in an infrared aerial photograph of how much hotter synthetic turf can be. So again, you're losing a lot of those benefits with that. If you remove landscapes, you can also remove wildlife habitat, which we discussed earlier. So this is, you know, a squirrel who's chewing the bark of a tree, which is not the best health for the tree, but they do have a place. And birds and raccoons and all of that, they need places to go, and we've seen vegetation when it's taken away to do development and things like that, how we have the migration of animals as well. So they do have a place, and we also need to consider their health. For a loss of recreational space, it's important for all generations. In this case, the study I found about older adults that actually had nearby parks or sidewalks, especially to walk on, so they had sidewalks to enjoy their green space. They found that they actually had a longer and more healthier life, and they tended to live 5 years longer over, they didn't live 5 years longer, but over a 5-year period, they had better health and longevity than if they didn't have those spaces. So again, even just the ability to walk in green space is providing good health benefits. And you've heard, you know, how you're supposed to get 30 minutes of exercise a day. Walking can actually fit that bill, and even if it's just strolling down the street, it's going to provide some benefits as well. For some of our populations, 80% of people live in urban areas, and so we've lost that connection to agriculture. So for some kids, you know, maybe going to a farm during their elementary school days is the only connection they have to agriculture. Well, they've realized this, and a lot of parks and recreation departments are having more of that connection to ag. I run the farmers market in Fort Collins, and we really try to focus on kids and having them connect with farmers so that they understand where food comes from, that it's just not in a package on a grocery store. And you've heard that, and it's kind of funny, but even just saying and asking kids, okay, what kind of, where do peaches come from? What kind of plant do they grow on? Some of them don't realize that peaches come from a tree and that they can be grown in Colorado. So it can be really used to preserve that agricultural heritage, to connect kids, and then also provide education. So that's really important as well. And in some kids' lives, a park is really all they have that connects them to nature, but it's something, and that's really important as well. So as we plan for drought, communities are really good about making policies, helping inform homeowners. This article was in the Greeley Tribune back in January, where the city of Greeley decided to allocate budgets for every person who lives in a household, so they would get so much water, essentially, per month based on the number of residents in the household. So that was something they launched, and it was really to build awareness. You know, how much are you using? You know, how much water are you using when you flush a toilet? If you take a shower, if you have a vegetable garden, you know, trying to allocate for that. And really starting the process before crisis occurs. I think we've all learned that reacting instead of being proactive is not necessarily the best approach. When we had the droughts in the 2000s, our BMPs were established, so these are the best management practices that were promoted by Green Co. and that we all tend to practice in the landscape industry. But these also are guidelines on, you know, how to reduce water consumption, protecting water quality, while maintaining and designing beautiful landscapes. So having water-friendly landscapes, having proper irrigation systems, irrigating appropriately, all of those are part of Green Co's BMPs. And we need to think about prioritization. So those old, mature trees should be our first priority. We shouldn't let them go because the benefits they provide far outweigh a tree that's maybe a year or two old. Not that all trees aren't important, they are, but you have to remember that the environmental, the aesthetics, everything that those old trees provide outweighs a lot of the reasoning behind it, perhaps. Focus irrigation efforts on recreational areas, so we can't just stop watering our parks. What does that leave for our kids to play on or for our dogs to romp around in? And just the psychological benefit. But it is important to avoid over-irrigation and runoff. This is a great example of over-irrigation, and I'll pick on CSU. So this is the campus. This is actually right in front of the horticulture building. And so it's somewhere where I go on nearly a daily basis. But you can see that we have sidewalks that are wet, we have a lot of misting going on, and so this is where we can really start to conserve. And so is there a better way to water this mound, or the hump or the bump is what our students call it? Is there a better way? Should we implement new technology? And thinking about those things as well. Financial incentives by the cities and municipalities are nothing new, so the city of Fort Collins has done a great job about encouraging financial incentives. Basically, you can get some really great water conservation technology, and you get a huge rebate as a result. I know that some of those benefits ran out, but still, it's great that people are taking advantage of it, and I know that they also provide incentives for low-flow toilets and shower heads and things like that. And all of that is important, but we can really make strides again in the landscape conservation side of things. We need to budget accordingly, so fixing broken heads, fixing leaks, yes, all of this takes labor and time, but it's also going to be of benefit. So here's another shot of the CSU campus. The sprinkler head was broken for 2 straight summers. No matter how much Dr. Koski tried to tell the maintenance staff, and you know, on the CSU campus, it's tough when you have acres and acres and thousands of sprinkler heads to maintain. And there's one irrigation repair person, so that's a lot of heads for one person. But you know, directing sprinkler overthrow and things like that, and then making the necessary repairs or swapping out old heads for newer technology, and utilizing some of those programs. An area again that I work really exclusively in and help promote is education. So formal and informal educational opportunities, so this would be more of a formal presentation, but then what I'm hoping is you'll take this information back to your constituents and help share that. Helping educate consumers about water-saving technologies. If you have Alexa with Amazon, you can actually have Alexa turn on and off your sprinkler system, which is pretty cool. I have Alexa, I haven't had her do that because I operate my system manually. But then taking advantage of, you know, water conservation controllers, soil moisture sensors, and all of those things. And really, the landscape industry has made huge scientific strides in making technology better. And then for homeowners, plant selection, mulch. So if there's one thing we could sell in extension, it would probably be mulch. We promote mulch so heavily, but again, it helps with mitigating those soil moisture temperatures, helps with weed control. Mulch is the greatest thing for plants, and utilizing it more in areas that it doesn't make sense to have vegetation. Maybe just mulching it over. I've recommended that to a lot of people. It's, why can't I grow grass under these 5 mature shade trees? That's too shady. What should I do? Mulch it. It's a great solution. Prioritizing watering, so that goes back to what's the most important aspects that you need to water. And then, of course, using pesticides, whether it be herbicides or insecticides, using those cautiously and practically. So addressing the problem first, what is causing the issue, and then using those so that it has the correct approach, and using IPM and things of that nature. So this is my final slide. So again, what we have already done in the past can really help direct us for the future. The 3% of water use in Colorado used for landscapes provides far more than just a pretty place to look at. It really gives us a lot of community involvement, and it really gives us, I think, a sense of place that we all need as a population. So
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. If anyone has any questions, if you could type them into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar toolbar, it's down towards the bottom. Or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. Okay. Well, I am not seeing any questions at this point, so we will go ahead and wrap up. Thank you again so much, Alison O'Connor with CSU, for being here with us today. I really enjoyed all these slides, and so I'm definitely going to put them up on our YouTube channel and make sure that this is shared. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.